ISIS has released a new video purportedly showing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the terror group's reclusive leader, giving an address. If it is him, it's the first time he's been seen on video since July of 2014. The footage shows a bearded man who resembles al-Baghdadi, although significantly older and heavier, praising the terrorists who carried out the Sri Lanka bombings. NBC News could not verify the exact date and time of the recording or if it is actually al-Baghdadi. In the past several years, multiple reports have questioned whether al-Baghdadi is actually still alive. Joining us now, member of the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee's independent Senator Angus King of Maine. Senator King just returned from a 3-day trip to Iraq. And Senator, we welcome you back to the show. The president is so proud of the ground he has gained on ISIS. What do you make of the reality?
They actually says
he says they're beaten.
They're beaten and defeated.
Well, that's not what I found in Iraq, and of course that's not what al-Baghdadi said yesterday, and that's not what happened in Sri Lanka. What I heard from everyone that I met with, Iraqi officials, our policy people on the ground in Iraq, is that ISIS is very much alive. Estimates are 15 to 20,000 fighters. It's true that they've lost the caliphate, the real estate, the ground that they controlled in Syria and Iraq. But they've now become much more similar to al-Qaeda. And just because al-Qaeda didn't control any territory didn't mean that we weren't going to take them seriously as a threat for almost 20 years. So ISIS is still a threat. The idea is there, the radical ideology is there, and that was the consistent message that I heard in Iraq, particularly from Iraqi officials and the Kurds.
Senator, it's Willie Geist. I think many Americans have been so consumed over the last couple of years with domestic policies and everything that's coming out of the Trump administration that they've taken the eye off of Iraq a bit. I think it's fair to say that. But you were just there on the ground. What can you tell Americans and our viewers about what's happening there and what the American role is in what's happening there?
Well, I mentioned the principal message that I heard was that ISIS is serious and we need to be focused upon it. But the second message was they want a continuity of American policy. The Americans are playing a very important role there. There are not a lot of Americans there. I think it's between 5,000 and 8,000. By the way, the coalition that's involved in fighting ISIS is 79 different countries. I was in a mess hall in Taji, one of the bases. There were Swedes, Canadians, and of course Americans. There are 79 countries, but America is the glue of that coalition. And the message that I got from, particularly from the Kurds and also Iraqi public officials, is stay the course, stay with us, because we're providing and giving them a hope of some stability. And ISIS could pretty easily reconstitute and move on Baghdad, for example, which they did a year or so ago. So I think that's what those were the two consistent messages that I heard all over the country.
So fair to say the people you talk to on the ground actually doing the fighting don't believe that ISIS has been defeated?
That's absolutely true.
Okay, let's bring into the conversation also staff writer for The New Yorker, author of the book The Forever War, Dexter Filkins, his new piece for the magazine entitled John Bolton on the Warpath, Can Trump's National Security Advisor Sell the Isolationist Presidency on Military Force? Dexter, it's always great to see you. We're going to talk about your Bolton piece in just a minute, but we were talking in the break, I mentioned your book, Forever War. I couldn't believe when I look back that it came out in 2008, almost 11 years ago. At that time, we were talking about Afghanistan as a forever war. Here we are now, 19 years almost into it, and it continues unabated.
It's like forever and then some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
well, they're talking, there's peace talks that are pretty serious. So it seems to get more likely. President Trump said he wants to get out, wants to pull everyone out. So, and the Americans that are there, for the most part, are behind the scenes. They're doing a lot of training. But but we're still there.
When you wrote Forever War, we were talking about Al-Qaeda, now we're talking about ISIS.
Same guys.
What about, talk about the sort of the distinction there and what you see about what the senator's talking about in Iraq. The presence of ISIS continued despite what the president says.
Well, look, Baghdadi used to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they just it was a name change. But the principal difference between ISIS and Al Qaeda was that Al Qaeda was essentially a guerrilla movement. You know, they were in hiding, and they would come out and do an attack and then go back into hiding. Whereas ISIS was claiming territory, the caliphate, and so ISIS now is becoming like Al Qaeda once was, which is it's going back into the shadows. And so essentially Baghdadi was just proclaiming, I'm still here, you know, I'm still here. Although you'll notice that I think on the video, the parts about Sri Lanka, the attack, were audio, not video. So it looks like that video was actually taken some time ago.
Dexter, I feel like this is a good hedgeway into talking about this profile that you wrote for The New Yorker about John Bolton, because in it you write that President Trump wanted to get out of Afghanistan, he wanted to get out of Syria, and that forces within the administration tried to temper his influence, which on the one hand, I find incredibly disturbing because it's usurping the power of the commander-in-chief. So you describe this convoluted lack of a process now that John Bolton is in his position, and he seems to be pushing for war and regime change in Venezuela, almost, if my read of your profile is correct.
Definitely. I think that was the big surprise for me was in reporting this piece was that on one hand, you have Bolton, who's always been really aggressive. He's for an aggressive American foreign policy. He's advocated bombing Iran, bombing North Korea. And you have a president who doesn't want any of that. He wants out. You know, he wants to bring all the American troops home. He wants to cut all of our commitments. He doesn't want to spend the money. And so there's really a pretty fundamental divide inside the White House between those two guys.
And Bolton also seems to be more concerned with Iran than North Korea, according to your reporting.
I think so. I mean, some people use the word obsession with Iran, but I don't know if I'd go that far. But I think he's long been focused on those two countries because they're both trying to develop nuclear weapons. And so I think that's, in fairness to him, that's it. You know, I think when as one of his aides said to me, when he wakes up in the morning, he thinks about nuclear weapons and how do I protect the United States from countries with nuclear weapons.
Senator King, Dexter writes in his piece, and he quotes some officials as saying that John Bolton, despite China and Russia being our greatest threats and rivals in the world, John Bolton has this, quote, anal focus on Iran and has for 20 years. What's your view of John Bolton as the right hand to President Trump on matters of national security?
Well, the first thing I want to say is, despite the superficial resemblance, I am not John Bolton. I want to get that out there.
It is really close, Senator, now that I look at it.
I get that sometimes in airports. I prefer Ted Turner, frankly, because there's more dough there. But it's very concerning. And in fact, that was one of the issues that we talked about in Iraq. Iran is, I use the old term from law school, a brooding omnipresence. They're the neighbor of Iraq. They've had a major war with Iraq. They're different ethnic. People forget that Iraqis and most of the Middle East are Arabs. The Iranians are Persian. They've been at each other for several thousand years, Darius the Great. And so what worries people is that we need to work on containing Iran, but not provoking them to the point where we end up in a significant war in that region. They have a significant role in Iraqi politics, but not a controlling one, and I think we want to keep it that way. And I think it's a narrow path. What worries me about John Bolton is that, as I think you mentioned, he has advocated bombing, he's advocated aggressive military action. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is a major modern country with 80 million people, sophisticated anti-aircraft. This would be a real war. And, frankly, I've never understood why we got out of the nuclear agreement, which was working. Everybody agrees it was working. Even Mike Pompeo, when he was at the CIA, said it was working. And yet we got out, and we've basically taken away that control over Iran's nuclear weapons. So the question is controlling Iran, but not to the point where we provoke a confrontation that could be catastrophic.
And Senator, a couple of other issues. What do you make of the proposal to charge asylum seekers a fee? Is there any reason why that would be a good idea?
Well, clearly it's designed to try to impair people's ability to seek asylum. People will probably find the money because they're fleeing for their lives, and they'd have to do it. But to me, the first thing I thought of was the poll tax in the South, which was designed to disenfranchise African Americans. Asylum is part of our law. It's part of international law. It's part of American law. And we have a dark history. The turning away of the USS St. Louis during the Holocaust is a black spot on American history. And here we are essentially talking about keeping out people who are fleeing for their lives. There are parts of the proposal that make sense, trying to accelerate the adjudication of whether it's a valid asylum claim. But imposing a fee just seems sort of gratuitous, and it may interfere with a few people. But if I'm running from a gang in Central America, I'm going to scare up $100 if that's what it takes, and I don't think it's going to deter anybody.
Yeah. Also, speaking of laws and process, I'm curious because there's so many different ways this president or his family is pushing back against the questions that are being asked of them, subpoenas, bank documents, and even now a lawsuit in return for these requests. Where does this go? And is there a process, and are there laws in place to force the president and his family to comply with questions about whether or not they have conflicts of interest?
Well, I think the first point to be made is that we have a constitutional republic, and the Congress is a co-equal branch of government with the presidency. In fact, that's just the way our system is set up. So subpoenas are part of the process. They're part of the process of fact-finding. And Congress has the power to hold people in contempt if they don't abide by subpoenas. It rarely ever comes to that. Usually there's some negotiation. But in this case, the president's filed a lawsuit and to try to block the subpoena to Deutsche Bank to try to determine conflicts of interest and relationships. And I think that's, as my father used to say, that's why they invented courts. They're going to make that determination.
It's going to be a busy time. Senator
Yes, ma'am.
Angus King, always great to see you. Thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Thank you, and thanks to the coach there, Coach Scarborough.
Yes, Coach Scarborough is amazing.
You are welcome.
Best coach ever. Thanks very much, Senator. We'll talk to you
indeed.
soon. Willie.